So what's wrong with citing summary sources? Well, I want to start with this. There's a lot of different ways you can use sources, and I've said that a couple of times. Like, there's knowledge building sources. That's tertiary. A lot of times you will see people cite tertiary sources because they're maybe can't, like, the goal is always like to get as close as possible like to the original like source of the information. It's typically not a good idea to quote like what this person said like in this other article, like to have these like whole extra steps, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But sometimes there are places for like tertiary sources that provide like some overview and some quick data, especially as a researcher, and every now and then you might see a need to cite it if it's a super credible like tertiary source. If you're trying to provide evidence, which is usually what we go to first, is that secondary stuff, like you're trying to prove a point, so you're going to get the scholar's commentary to back you up on something. If you're getting like an original like new study, then the data itself might be a little bit more primary, but typically evidence for a point is secondary sources, and sometimes primary if you're getting into that like original data and the original studies themselves for things. Typically primary sources make really good means of like illustrating points, because when you're writing for other people, like you want to be heard and understood, so you really need to be able to illustrate and explain well what you're thinking and why you're interpreting the information and the events the way that you are, so that people can understand where you're coming from and why you're seeing it this way. So like again, like when I used 9/11, like the sources that came out later, a lot of times what they used was original like transcripts and live coverage and videos and interviews and all that stuff, because it helps like engage the reader and help them see the issue and see what you're talking about. And if you try to comment on it without using this stuff, it's just not as effective. It's not as clear, because you're really like removing your reader's ability to see what's happening as well. So there's a lot of different ways to use sources. Tertiary sources, again, make great knowledge builders. They don't typically make great evidence. Again, they're usually there to help get people off the ground. And the reason is, I guess, getting into knowledge of conventions a little bit, one of our key concepts. One of the things is as the writer and the researcher, your personal credibility, and your respect for readers and for the conversation as the creator of that text and meeting the standards, like we talked about with knowledge of conventions and genre. It's like being able to have some wiggle room, but understanding what the expectations are. And sometimes it's also like community expectations for us for like research and writing in a certain field. So like academic genre conventions and credibility have a higher standard. And this, in order to have that level of respect, things that your readers will expect from you is a lot of responsibility with your research and analysis and expertise, and they will expect that if you're writing into this conversation, you have this complex and nuanced understanding of the issue, and that you've put in the hard work, and that you have a respect for academic research standards. And so one of the big like research standards is that you're going to try to get as close to the original information as possible. And because tertiary sources are often so removed and they're not providing any sort of analysis or commentary, they're not really writing into the issue as part of the conversation. They're sort of providing tools and resources from outside the conversation for people to use that are commenting on the issue.